poor single dad helps stranded twin girls, unaware their father is the judge who held his fate. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much! Now, let's return to our main character. His name was Ethan Cole, and on that morning, he stood alone at the defense table of a county courthouse that smelled faintly of old paper, floor wax, and quiet judgment, wearing a jacket that had seen too many winters and a calm that had seen worse, while the room buzzed with low laughter and impatient whispers, as if everyone had already decided who he was before he ever spoke. A poor single dad with tired eyes and calloused hands, the kind of man people look through instead of at, the kind of man the system expects to fold. And as the clerk shuffled files and the prosecutor tapped a pen with rehearsed confidence, Ethan kept his hands folded, steady, not because he was fearless, but because fear had long ago taught him how to be still, how to stand without asking for mercy, how to let truth arrive on its own time. And when the judge's chair creaked above him, elevated and distant, Ethan felt the familiar weight of being measured by appearances, by a balance sheet of assumptions that never accounted for late nights packing lunches, or the way he walked his daughter to school every morning, even when the wind cut through his coat like a blade, or the way he fixed what was broken without asking who owned it. And as the judge glanced down at the docket, unaware of the thin thread of grace already woven between them, Ethan's mind drifted back just one day earlier to a cold bus stop on the edge of town where the rain came down sideways and the streetlights flickered like tired sentinels, to two small figures huddled beneath a torn backpack, twin girls no older than 9, shivering in soaked sneakers, their teeth chattering louder than the traffic. And to the moment he had stopped without thinking, because stopping was what decent people did, because some lessons don't wait for permission, and he remembered how one of the girls had tried to smile through the cold, how the other had held her sister's hand like an anchor, and how he had shrugged off his jacket and draped it over their shoulders, feeling the rain soak through his shirt while the girl's shaking eased, and how he had bought them hot cocoa with the last few dollars in his pocket, steam rising into the night like a small prayer, and how he never once asked their last name or who their father was. Because kindness doesn't check resumes, and back in the courtroom the murmur swelled and faded as the judge adjusted his glasses, a man known for precision, for rules, for holding fate with a measured voice, and Ethan looked up only once, meeting the bench with quiet eyes that didn't beg or challenge, eyes that had already learned the cost of pride and the power of restraint, and in that instant, before a single word was spoken, before any verdict hovered in the air, the room balanced on something fragile and unseen, a truth still unnamed, a connection still unrecognized, the kind that arrives not with thunder, but with silence. And as the gavel rested unmoved, and the clock ticked toward whatever would come next, no one in that room knew that the cold rain, the bus stop, the twin girls, and the man standing alone were already rewriting what justice would sound like when it finally spoke. The afternoon before that courtroom morning had not begun with destiny or drama, but with exhaustion, the kind that settles deep in the bones after years of doing everything yourself, because when Ethan Cole clocked out of the warehouse just after 4, his shoulders ached, his palms were raw, and his thoughts were already on dinner, homework, and whether the heat would hold through the night. And as he pedaled his old bike toward the bus stop, where he always waited to catch the transfer home, the sky darkened faster than the forecast promised, clouds rolling in low and heavy, squeezing the light out of the street one block at a time. And then the rain came, not polite rain, but sharp, slanted sheets that stung the skin and turned sidewalks into mirrors. And that was when he saw them, two small figures standing too close together beneath the broken shelter at the stop, their jackets thin, their shoes soaked through. One girl clutching a backpack with a torn strap, while the other rubbed her arms in tight circles, trying to keep warm, and Ethan slowed, not because he was curious, but because something in him always responded to quiet need, because some people do not need a reason to stop, and as he leaned his bike against the pole and stepped closer, he noticed their identical faces, pale with cold, eyes wide but guarded, the kind of eyes children learn to wear when they have been disappointed too many times. And he asked gently if they were waiting for someone, his voice low so it would not sound like a demand, and the taller one nodded, saying their bus never came, while the other whispered that their phone had died, and Ethan did not ask where their parents were or why they were alone because fear closes children faster than cold. So instead he shrugged off his jacket and draped it around both of them, ignoring the chill that crept immediately into his own shirt. And when the smaller one protested, saying he would get sick, he smiled and said he had been colder, which was true in ways she could not yet understand. And he walked them across the street to the diner, the bell over the door ringing sharp and bright as warmth rushed out to meet them. And he ordered 2 hot chocolates with extra marshmallows, pushing the mug handles toward their hands as steam curled upward. And only then did he notice how hard they were shaking, not just from the cold but from holding themselves together. And as they drank, color slowly returning to their cheeks, he asked their names, Lily and Rose, identical twins, 9 years old. And when he asked who they were waiting for, Lily said their father was working late and Rose added that he always came, always, and Ethan nodded, believing them because believing costs nothing. And when the rain showed no sign of stopping and the clock crept past 6, he called the non-emergency number, not because he wanted to hand them off, but because safety matters more than sentiment. And while they waited, he shared half his grilled cheese, listened as they talked about school, about spelling tests and a science project they had forgotten at home. And when the police officer arrived, respectful and calm, Ethan stood back, answering questions plainly, declining praise, and as the twins were guided gently toward the cruiser, Lily turned back and hugged him hard around the waist, Rose copying her a second later, their small arms fierce and sudden, and Ethan froze for a heartbeat before resting his hands lightly on their shoulders, telling them they would be all right, because sometimes that is the only promise you can make honestly. And he watched as the car pulled away, rain streaking the windows until the red lights vanished into the gray, and he put his jacket back on, now damp and heavy, and rode home through the storm, unaware that the man who would soon judge his worth had already measured his character through the quiet safety of his children, long before a single word would be spoken in court. The night after the rain passed quietly, the kind of quiet that settles in once the world believes it has finished with you, and Ethan Cole returned to his small apartment just before 8, wiping his bike tires at the door out of habit, shaking the cold from his hands before turning the key, and inside the familiar hum of the refrigerator and the soft glow of a single lamp welcomed him home, where his daughter Mia sat at the table coloring with intense concentration, her tongue pressed lightly to the corner of her mouth the way she did when she was determined, and she looked up and smiled, asking if the rain had stopped, and Ethan said not really, but it would, always did, and he warmed leftover soup on the stove while listening to her recount her day. The spelling quiz she thought she failed, the classmate who cried because her shoelace would not stay tied, and Ethan nodded, stirring slowly, because listening was something he could always give. And later that night after Mia was asleep and the dishes were done, he sat on the edge of the couch holding the envelope he had not yet opened, the one that had been wedged under the door sometime during the afternoon, its official seal heavy with meaning, and when he finally slid his finger beneath the flap, the paper inside unfolded into a summons, clean and impersonal, informing him of a court appearance scheduled for the following morning, concerning a workplace incident from months earlier, an accident that had already taken his job and nearly taken his hope with it. And Ethan closed his eyes for a long moment, breathing in slowly, not in panic but in acceptance, because when you live long enough at the edge of survival, surprises lose their power to shock, and he placed the paper neatly on the table, set his alarm, and went to bed without complaint, because worry never made morning come any slower. And when dawn arrived gray and thin, he woke before the alarm, dressed quietly, and left a note for Mia beside her lunch, reminding her that he would be home by dinner and that she was stronger than she thought. And as he walked to the courthouse, the city moved around him with practiced indifference, commuters rushing, doors opening and closing, lives intersecting without pause, and inside the building the air felt colder, heavier, polished floors reflecting fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead, and Ethan took his place among others waiting, some with lawyers whispering at their sides, others staring straight ahead, and he noticed two small figures seated near the back, Lily and Rose, their hair neatly brushed, their coats dry and clean, sitting between a man whose posture was rigid and controlled, a man in a dark suit, whose hands were folded tightly in his lap, his gaze fixed forward as if the room itself demanded obedience. And Ethan recognized the girls instantly, but did not approach, because moments have rules, and this one was not his, and the twins saw him too, their faces lighting briefly before they remembered where they were, and they smiled small, polite smiles, the kind children learn when they know they must be quiet, and Ethan returned the smile with a nod, nothing more. And when the bailiff called the room to order and the judge entered, everyone rose, and the man beside the girls stood as well, tall, composed, his presence commanding attention without asking for it. And Ethan did not yet know his name or his title, only that the air shifted when he moved. That authority clung to him like a tailored coat. And as the judge took his seat and the proceedings began, Ethan stood alone when his name was called, no counsel beside him, no argument prepared beyond the truth, and from the bench, unseen by most, the man beside the twins finally turned his head, his eyes settling on Ethan with a flicker of recognition, a tightening at the jaw, as memory stirred not of legal briefs or case law, but of a rain-soaked bus stop, two frightened daughters, and a stranger who asked for nothing in return. The courtroom settled into a tense rhythm as the proceedings moved forward, voices rising and falling with practiced certainty, and Ethan Cole stood where he had been directed, shoulders squared, eyes forward, feeling the weight of the room press in on him from every side, because courtrooms have a way of reminding people who holds power and who does not. And as the prosecutor began outlining the case, his tone was confident, almost casual, describing the workplace accident in clean, detached language, a misfiled report, a missed safety protocol, a conclusion drawn before questions were asked, and Ethan listened without interruption, because he had learned long ago that speaking too soon only fed assumptions. And as the words echoed against the high ceiling, he noticed the small reactions around him, the subtle nods, the exchanged glances, the quiet judgment forming before he was given a chance to speak, and yet through it all, he remained still, his hands clasped loosely in front of him, breathing slow and even, because panic had never solved anything worth fixing. And when it was finally his turn, when the room shifted its attention toward the man without a lawyer, Ethan spoke plainly, not to persuade, but to clarify, explaining what he saw, what he did, what he reported, his voice steady, unembellished, and as he spoke, he did not point fingers or ask for sympathy. He simply told the truth the way it happened, one fact at a time, trusting that truth did not need decoration. And from the bench, the judge listened, expression unreadable. But beside the twins, their father listened differently, his attention no longer divided, his posture no longer rigid, because recognition had sharpened into certainty. And as Ethan described the accident, the decision to stay late, the choice to help a coworker rather than walk away, the man in the dark suit remembered another choice made without calculation, another moment when a stranger had stepped in simply because it was right. And Lily and Rose sat quietly, their feet not quite touching the floor, eyes moving between Ethan and their father, sensing the invisible thread tightening between them. And when the prosecutor pressed harder, questioning Ethan's judgment, suggesting negligence, the room seemed to lean forward, waiting for him to falter, but Ethan did not raise his voice or rush his answers. He acknowledged mistakes where they were real and corrected assumptions where they were not. And there was a pause, a small one, when the judge asked a question that required more than a yes or no, and Ethan answered with care, choosing words that reflected responsibility rather than defense. And in that pause, the air shifted again, because something about his composure did not fit the narrative that had been prepared for him, and the judge leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing not with suspicion but with thought. And beside the twins, Their father felt the quiet weight of memory settle fully into place. The sound of rain, the warmth of cocoa, the jacket draped around small shoulders, and he realized with a sharp clarity that the man standing alone before the court was the same man who had stood between his daughters and fear, not because he had to, but because no one else had, and the realization did not arrive with drama or anger. It arrived with stillness, the kind that forces a person to reconsider the measure they use to judge others. And as the judge called for a brief recess, the room exhaled, people shifting in their seats, whispers starting and stopping, and Ethan stepped back, unsure of what would come next but certain of one thing, that whatever the outcome, he had not compromised himself to survive it. And across the aisle, unseen by most, the father of the twins placed a steady hand on each girl's shoulder, grounding them, grounding himself. Because in that moment, the law was no longer an abstract principle, it was personal, and it was watching. When the recess ended and the courtroom reconvened, the atmosphere had changed in a way that was difficult to name but impossible to ignore. As if the room itself had grown more attentive, and Ethan Cole returned to his place with the same quiet posture, unaware of the internal reckoning unfolding just a few feet away. Because Judge Daniel Hawthorne, the father of Lily and Rose, no longer heard the proceedings as distant procedure, but as something uncomfortably close to home. And as he adjusted his glasses and reviewed the file again, he saw it differently now, not as a list of allegations, but as a record of decisions made under pressure. And across the aisle, the prosecutor resumed, with renewed urgency, pressing for a firm interpretation of liability, citing regulations and precedent with crisp precision. And the words were correct, technically sound, but something in their delivery rang hollow, because law without context can sound complete, while still missing the truth. And Judge Hawthorne listened carefully, asking measured questions, his tone neutral, his face controlled, yet inside his thoughts returned again and again to that night, to the way his daughters had spoken about the man who helped them, not as a hero but as someone kind, someone who treated them as if they mattered. And as Ethan responded to another question, explaining once more why he stayed late, why he followed protocol as he understood it, why he believed helping a coworker was not negligence but responsibility, the judge felt a familiar tension rise, the tension between the letter of the law and the spirit that gave it meaning. And Lily and Rose sat very still, sensing the gravity of the moment without fully understanding it, their hands folded in their laps the way their father had taught them. And when the judge asked the court reporter to mark a specific document for review, the room quieted, the hum of the lights suddenly louder, and Judge Hawthorne leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but deliberate, asking a question that shifted the direction of the case, one that required clarification of a procedural detail overlooked in the initial report. And the prosecutor hesitated, flipping pages, because the detail existed but had not been emphasized. And Ethan watched without expectation, answering when addressed, remaining silent when not, because he had already said what he could say honestly. And as the judge requested the original incident logs and safety records be brought forward, murmurs rippled through the gallery, subtle but unmistakable. And in that moment, Judge Hawthorne felt the weight of his role more heavily than he had in years, not because the case was complex, but because it was clear in a way that demanded courage rather than cleverness. And he glanced once toward his daughters, seeing them watch Ethan with a quiet trust that children reserve for those who have earned it without trying, and something settled in his chest. Not bias, not favoritism, but resolve, the resolve to ensure that justice did not become careless simply because the person standing alone was easy to overlook. And as the documents were reviewed and discrepancies surfaced, small but significant, the judge's questions became more precise, his tone firmer, not accusatory but exacting, and the prosecutor adjusted, recalibrated, acknowledging gaps that could not be ignored. And through it all, Ethan remained the same, neither hopeful nor defeated, just present. And when the judge finally paused, setting the papers down, the courtroom fell into a deep, expectant silence, the kind that signals a turning point, and Judge Hawthorne took a measured breath, aware that whatever he said next would not only affect the man before him, but would echo back to the example he set for his children. And in that stillness, Before any ruling was announced, it became clear that this case would not be decided by assumption or convenience, but by careful truth, and that sometimes the quietest acts of integrity have a way of finding their way back into the room where justice is decided. As the silence stretched after Judge Hawthorne set the documents aside, time seemed to slow in the courtroom, each second marked by the faint hum of the overhead lights and the soft scratch of the court reporter's pen. And Ethan Cole stood where he was, feeling the familiar uncertainty of waiting without control. Because waiting had become a language he understood well, waiting for buses, waiting for paychecks, waiting for doors that rarely opened. And yet this waiting felt different, heavier, as if something unseen had already begun to move. And Judge Hawthorne cleared his throat, his voice measured as he addressed the room, stating that before any determination could be made, the court would require a full review of the original incident logs, the internal safety audits, and the follow-up reports that had been summarized but not examined in detail. And the prosecutor nodded, professional but tense, acknowledging the request, while a low murmur rippled briefly through the gallery before settling again. And as files were retrieved and passed forward, Ethan watched the process with quiet attention, not hope exactly, but a steady resolve to remain present, because he had learned that outcomes change more easily than character. And across the aisle, Lily and Rose sat side by side, their feet swinging slightly, their eyes fixed on Ethan with a look that was neither fear nor expectation, but recognition. And Judge Hawthorne noticed it, the way his daughters watched the man who had helped them, without knowing who they were. And he felt the weight of that watching pressed gently, but firmly against his chest, because children see what adults often overlook. And as the judge reviewed the additional materials, his questions grew more specific, focusing on timing, on who authorized what, on the sequence of decisions made during the shift in question. And with each answer, the picture became clearer, not simpler, but more honest, revealing that responsibility had been distributed unevenly, that assumptions had filled gaps where facts should have stood, and that Ethan's actions, while imperfect, aligned more closely with concern than negligence. And the prosecutor adjusted again, conceding points where the record no longer supported the initial narrative. And in that moment, the courtroom no longer felt adversarial, but investigative, as if the truth itself had been invited to take a seat. And Ethan answered when called upon, his voice calm, his words precise, never overstating, never retreating. And Judge Hawthorne listened not as a father or a judge alone, but as a man confronted with the reminder that authority carries responsibility beyond procedure. And when he asked one final clarifying question, the room leaned in, because it was the kind of question that often determines direction. And Ethan responded simply, explaining that when he chose to stay late and assist, he did so because someone needed help, and leaving did not feel right. And he accepted that consequences followed choices, but he did not believe compassion should be treated as misconduct. And there was no challenge in his tone, only conviction, and Judge Hawthorne sat back, absorbing the answer, the memory of rain and cocoa resurfacing once more, not as sentiment but as evidence of a pattern. And he realized that the court was not merely deciding a case, it was setting a measure, one that his daughters would learn from long after the file was closed. And as he announced that the court would take a brief pause to finalize its review before issuing a determination, the tension in the room did not break but shifted, settling into a deep, expectant stillness. And Ethan exhaled slowly, not in relief but in acceptance, because whatever came next, he had stood as himself. And across the aisle, Judge Hawthorne placed a steady hand on each of his daughter's shoulders once more, grounding them, grounding himself, knowing that when he spoke again, his words would need to honor not only the law, but the quiet dignity that had already spoken first. When the court resumed for what felt like the final stretch, the air carried a different weight, quieter now, as if the room itself had learned to listen. And Ethan Cole stood once more at the center of it all, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, because steadiness had become his refuge. And Judge Daniel Hawthorne returned to the bench with deliberate calm, his movements precise, his face composed, yet his eyes held a depth that had not been there before. And as he looked out across the courtroom, he did not begin with a ruling but with a pause, allowing the silence to settle fully, a silence that demanded attention without raising its voice. And then he spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly, explaining that the court had completed its review of the supplemental records, that discrepancies had been identified, and that assumptions made early in the case required correction. And as he spoke, the prosecutor listened closely, nodding where the facts no longer resisted, accepting that the foundation of the case had shifted, and Ethan listened too, absorbing each word without anticipation, because experience had taught him that clarity often arrives quietly. And as the judge continued, outlining how the incident logs revealed incomplete reporting and how responsibility had been assigned without sufficient examination of context, a subtle change moved through the room, shoulders easing, whispers fading, attention sharpening, and Lily and Rose sat very still, their eyes fixed on their father now, sensing the importance of the moment, and Judge Hawthorne glanced briefly toward them before returning his gaze to Ethan. And in that glance was not favoritism but resolve, the resolve to be worthy of the trust his children placed in him. And he addressed Ethan directly, acknowledging his cooperation, his consistency, and the fact that his account aligned with the fuller record, now before the court. And when the judge stated that the court found no grounds to uphold the original finding of negligence as it had been presented, a breath moved through the room, collective but restrained, and Ethan felt it, not as relief exactly, but as release, the kind that loosens something held too tightly for too long. And the judge went on, clarifying that while workplace safety remained paramount, compassion exercised in good faith could not be retroactively framed as misconduct without evidence, and that justice required discernment, not convenience. And as those words settled, the prosecutor formally withdrew the contested charge, his tone professional, his posture respectful, and Ethan remained silent, his eyes lowered for a moment, not in submission but in reflection, because vindication without humility often leaves nothing worth keeping. And Judge Hawthorne concluded by stating that the matter was resolved, that the record would reflect the corrected findings, and that Mr. Cole was free to go. And there was no gavel strike, no dramatic flourish, only a quiet finality that carried more weight than noise ever could. And as the judge stood to leave the bench, he paused just briefly and inclined his head toward Ethan, a gesture so small most people missed it, but one that spoke volumes to those who understood dignity. And Ethan met the gesture with a simple nod, no smile, no triumph, just acknowledgement, because respect does not need witnesses. And as the courtroom began to empty and Lily and Rose rose with their father, holding his hands as they always did, Judge Hawthorne felt a calm settle over him, the calm of knowing that for once, the law had not merely been applied, but honored, and that sometimes the truest measure of justice is whether it recognizes the quiet goodness that stood before it all along. After the courtroom emptied and the echo of footsteps faded down the marble hallways, Ethan Cole stepped outside into the late morning light, the sky pale and steady, the rain finally gone, and for a moment he simply stood there, breathing, because freedom does not always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like air returning to lungs you did not realize were tight. And as he adjusted the strap of his worn bag and turned toward the bus stop, he heard small footsteps behind him, quick and hesitant. And when he turned, Lily and Rose were there, tugging gently at their father's hands as Judge Daniel Hawthorne followed a few steps back, his expression no longer distant or formal, but thoughtful, human. And the twins broke free, running toward Ethan with unfiltered joy, wrapping their arms around him without asking permission, their laughter light and sudden, and Ethan froze for half a second, surprised, then knelt instinctively, steadying them, smiling softly as he asked if they were supposed to do that. And Lily looked up and said that he helped them when they were cold, and Rose nodded seriously, adding that their father said thank you mattered, and Ethan felt something warm settle in his chest, not pride, but connection. And Judge Hawthorne stepped forward then, extending his hand, introducing himself properly this time, his voice calm, respectful, not as a judge but as a father, and Ethan stood, shaking his hand firmly, meeting his eyes without fear or resentment, because the past hour had stripped both men down to what mattered. And Judge Hawthorne thanked him, not for the case, but for the night at the bus stop, for seeing his daughters as children first, not inconveniences, and Ethan shrugged slightly, saying anyone would have done the same, and the judge smiled faintly, knowing that was not true. And for a brief moment they stood there, 3 generations bound by a moment none of them had planned, and as the twins were gently ushered back, Rose turned once more, handing Ethan a small folded piece of paper, a drawing she had made, 2 stick figures under a streetlight, rain falling around them, and Ethan accepted it carefully, placing it in his pocket like something fragile and important, and Judge Hawthorne nodded once more, a quiet acknowledgement that required no witnesses, and they parted ways, each returning to their separate lives, but changed, and as Ethan rode the bus home, the city passing by in familiar patterns, he thought not about the courtroom or the ruling, but about the strange way life sometimes circles back, how small decisions echo louder than grand speeches, and when he reached his apartment and opened the door, Mia ran to him, asking if everything was okay, and Ethan knelt, hugging her tightly, telling her yes, it was, and later that afternoon, as he pinned Rose's drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a star, he realized that justice had not simply spared him. It had seen him, and that sometimes being seen is the miracle people never think to ask for. That evening settled gently over the city, the kind of evening that does not announce itself, but arrives all the same, and Ethan Cole stood by the window of his small apartment, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, their glow soft against the darkening sky, while Mia sat at the kitchen table doing her homework, humming quietly, safe and untroubled. And as Ethan listened to that sound, he felt the last of the tension drain from his shoulders, not because life had suddenly become easy, but because something essential had been restored, the simple assurance that doing the right thing had not gone unnoticed. And he thought back to the bus stop, to the rain and the cold, to the moment he chose to stop instead of passing by, realizing now that the choice had never been about reward or consequence. It had been about identity, about who he was when no one was watching, and across town, Judge Daniel Hawthorne sat at his own kitchen table with Lily and Rose, listening as they talked excitedly about school projects and favorite books, their laughter filling the room, and he watched them closely, seeing not just his daughters, but the values they were learning, the way they spoke about kindness as something natural, expected, and he understood with quiet clarity that the most important ruling he would ever make had not been delivered from the bench, but lived out in front of them. And later, as the twins prepared for bed, Lily asked why the man from the bus stop had been in court, and Hawthorne explained gently that sometimes good people face difficult situations, and that fairness means taking the time to truly see someone, and Rose nodded thoughtfully, saying that the man was brave because he did not yell or get angry, and Hawthorne smiled, because children often articulate truth more clearly than adults, and as the night deepened, Ethan sat at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold, the drawing from Rose still pinned to the refrigerator, and he reflected on how the day had ended not with applause or recognition, but with quiet understanding, and that felt right, because dignity does not seek an audience, it seeks alignment, and when Mia came to him before bed, asking why he looked tired but happy, he told her that sometimes being tired means you carried something important, and sometimes being happy means you were strong enough to put it down, and she hugged him, satisfied with the answer, and the apartment grew still, and somewhere between the hum of the city and the ticking of the clock, the story found its true ending, not in a courtroom or a ruling, but in the spaces between people where choices are made without witnesses. And as the lights went out and silence filled the room, one truth remained, steady and enduring, that kindness given quietly has a way of returning quietly, that justice does not always arrive with noise, and that a poor single father who chose compassion on a rainy night had reminded the world, and a judge, and 2 little girls, that character is the strongest authority of all. The days that followed moved forward without ceremony, as meaningful days often do, and Ethan Cole returned to his routines with the same quiet discipline that had carried him through harder seasons, waking before dawn, packing lunches, walking Mia to school beneath skies that shifted from gray to blue, and though nothing outward had changed dramatically, something inside him had settled into place, a steadiness born not of victory but of affirmation, and as he worked odd jobs and searched for new opportunities, he noticed small differences, conversations that lingered a little longer, people who listened more closely, because dignity has a way of changing how the world responds, even when no one can explain why. And across town, Judge Daniel Hawthorne resumed his work on the bench, case after case moving through his courtroom, yet something in his approach had softened, sharpened at the same time, as he took extra moments to ask clarifying questions, to look past assumptions. Remembering a man who stood alone without complaint and children who watched quietly from the gallery, and Lily and Rose carried their own lessons forward, telling classmates about the nice man who helped them when it rained, not knowing the full story, not needing to, because kindness had already made sense to them. And one afternoon weeks later, as Ethan waited at the same bus stop, where everything had begun, the streetlight flickering on above him, he saw the twins again, this time bundled warmly, laughing as they ran toward him, with permission given, their father following behind with an easy smile. And there were no heavy words exchanged, only simple greetings, an update about school, a brief thank you repeated not out of obligation, but sincerity. And as they parted ways once more, Ethan felt no sense of debt or destiny fulfilled, only quiet continuity, the reassurance that the world had room for decency after all. And that evening, as he sat with Maya at the kitchen table, helping her with math problems, she asked him why he always helped people, even when it made things harder. And Ethan thought for a moment before answering, telling her that helping does not always make life easier, but it makes it clearer, and clarity, he said, is what lets you sleep at night. And Mia nodded, accepting this truth the way children often do, simply. And as the lights dimmed and the city settled into its nighttime rhythm, the story reached its true conclusion, not in grand gestures or lasting recognition, but in the understanding that a poor single father, two stranded girls, and a judge bound by duty had all been changed by a single moment of grace, and that justice, when guided by character rather than pride, does not need to announce itself. It leaves behind something far more powerful, a silence filled with respect, and a reminder that the strongest authority in any room belongs to those who choose kindness when no one is watching. In the quiet weeks after everything had settled, life did not transform into something extraordinary, but it revealed something truer, and Ethan Cole came to understand that endings are rarely loud when they are honest, because honesty prefers room to breathe. And each morning he continued to wake before sunrise, the city still half asleep, making coffee that tasted too thin, packing Maya's lunch with careful attention, and walking her to school as they talked about ordinary things. And it was in those ordinary moments that the weight of what had happened finally found its place, not as a story to be retold, but as a lesson carried forward. And across town, Judge Daniel Hawthorne found himself thinking often of that day, not with regret or pride, but with reflection, because the law had done what it was meant to do only because someone had reminded it how. And as he presided over new cases, he listened longer, paused more often, allowing silence to do its work, understanding now that authority loses nothing by making room for humanity. And Lily and Rose noticed the change in their father too, the way he knelt to listen instead of standing to instruct, the way he spoke about fairness not as something imposed, but as something lived. And one afternoon, as the twins worked on a school project about community helpers, they included a drawing of a man at a bus stop holding a jacket open wide, labeling him simply as someone who helped. And when Hawthorne saw it pinned proudly to their classroom wall, he felt a quiet tightening in his chest, the good kind, the kind that reminds a person why responsibility matters. And Ethan never sought further connection, never followed up, never checked the news or court records to see how his case was referenced, because he did not need proof that it happened. He carried it in the way he stood a little straighter now, in the way he spoke to Mia about doing the right thing even when it was inconvenient. And in time, opportunity returned in its own way, a steady job offer from someone who had heard about his work ethic. Not the case, just the man. And as Ethan signed the papers, he thought briefly of the rain, the cocoa at the bus stop, and how one small decision had intersected with a larger system in a way neither could have predicted. And that evening, As he sat with Mia watching the lights of passing cars reflect against the window, he told her a simple truth, that sometimes people will never know how much good they do, and that is okay, because goodness is not a transaction. It is a responsibility to oneself. And Mia nodded, resting her head against his arm, comforted not by the story but by the certainty in his voice. And somewhere in the city, Judge Hawthorne tucked Lily and Rose into bed, reminding them to always help when they can, even if no one is watching. And as the night closed in around all of them, the story reached its quiet conclusion, not marked by applause or memory, but by continuity, by lives moving forward with a little more care, a little more grace, and the enduring understanding that justice is strongest when it is guided by character, and that sometimes the most powerful verdict is the one delivered in silence. In the final days of that season, when the memory of the courtroom had softened into something less sharp but more meaningful, Ethan Cole found himself once again at the same bus stop where the rain had first rewritten his path, this time under a clear sky, the streetlights steady above him, and he stood there not waiting for anything extraordinary, just waiting to go home. And as buses passed and the city moved on in its quiet rhythm, he understood something fully for the first time, that life does not reward goodness on a schedule, and it does not announce when it notices. But it does notice, and across town, Judge Daniel Hawthorne sat in chambers late one evening, reviewing files long after the courthouse had emptied, and when he closed the last folder and turned off the lamp, he lingered in the silence, thinking not of statutes or rulings, but of the example he was setting for Lily and Rose, because he now understood that justice is not something children learn from speeches, it is something they absorb from watching how adults treat those with less power. And at home, the twins slept peacefully, their drawings taped to the wall, reminders of small moments that mattered. And days later, when Ethan received his first full paycheck from his new job, he did not celebrate loudly. He simply folded the check carefully, placed it in an envelope, and sat with Mia at the kitchen table making plans that were modest but hopeful. A pair of new shoes, a school trip she wanted to take, and maybe a little saved for later. And as he listened to her talk, he realized that the greatest outcome of everything that had happened was not the dismissal of a charge or the recognition of a judge, but the quiet confirmation that he had shown his daughter who he was when tested, and that lesson would outlast any verdict. And one afternoon, not long after, as Ethan walked past the diner where he once bought cocoa on a cold night, he paused briefly, smiling to himself, because he knew that if faced with the same choice again, he would stop again, without hesitation, without calculation, and that certainty mattered more than any external validation. And somewhere in the city, Judge Hawthorne stood in a courtroom once more, delivering a ruling with measured calm, and when he finished, he allowed a moment of silence to settle before moving on, honoring the space where understanding lives. And in that shared silence, unseen but present, the story found its final shape, not as a tale of coincidence or fate, but as a reminder that dignity practiced quietly can realign even the strongest systems, that kindness does not need to be witnessed to be powerful, and that when a poor single father chose compassion on a rainy night, he did more than help two stranded girls. He reminded the world, without raising his voice, that character is the truest form of justice, and that when truth finally arrives, it often does so in silence. When the story finally reached its quiet end, it did so without ceremony, the way truths that last always seem to arrive, and Ethan Cole stood once more at his apartment window as night settled gently over the city, Mia already asleep, her backpack ready by the door for morning, and he understood that nothing about his life had become extraordinary in the eyes of the world. And that was exactly the point, because dignity does not need spectacle to survive, it needs consistency. And somewhere across town, Judge Daniel Hawthorne finished his evening routine. The courthouse long emptied, the echo of footsteps replaced by the steady calm of home. And as he turned off the lights, he paused by the doorway of Lily and Rose's room, watching them sleep, their faces peaceful, untouched by the weight of the systems adults build, and he knew with certainty that the most important thing he could give them was not protection or privilege, but an example of fairness lived quietly. And days later, when Ethan passed the courthouse on his way to work, he did not look up at it with bitterness or triumph, but with neutrality, because the place no longer held power over his sense of self. And as he moved through his days, helping where he could, speaking honestly, listening more than he talked, he noticed that the world responded differently, not dramatically, but respectfully, and respect earned quietly has a way of staying. And one afternoon, months later, as rain returned to the city in a soft, steady fall, Ethan saw a man hesitate at a bus stop, unsure whether to stop for someone in need, and without thinking, Ethan stepped in, offering help before doubt could take root. And he realized then that the true legacy of that night had nothing to do with courts or judges. It lived in repetition, in choosing again what had once been chosen without applause. And at dinner that evening, Mia asked him what it meant to be a good person, and Ethan answered simply that it meant doing what was right even when it was inconvenient, and even when no one was watching, and she nodded, satisfied, because children understand clarity when adults stop complicating it. And across the city, Judge Hawthorne delivered another ruling, his voice steady, his questions careful, and when the courtroom fell silent, he allowed the silence to linger, knowing now that silence can be an instrument of justice rather than avoidance. And when the day ended and the doors closed, nothing marked the moment as significant, no headlines, no recognition, just continuity, and that was enough, because the story was never about a poor single father being saved by a powerful judge. It was about a powerful system being reminded of its purpose by a man with nothing to gain. And as the night deepened, and the city breathed in unison, one truth remained clear and unshaken: that character speaks loudest when it whispers, that kindness given without expectation reshapes lives quietly, and that when dignity stands firm, even the highest bench must listen, and in that listening, the world does not erupt into applause. It becomes still, and in that stillness, justice finally finds its voice.